Hey guys, welcome back to Busted Seams. It has been a hot minute since I've given you a fashion industry related video. I've been experimenting with a few other things, and actually, as you can see, I've sort of turned my studio around and now you're facing the room instead of me facing a sad little corner over there. So I thought we should jump back in and do part 2 of fashion industry terminology and acronyms. So if you missed it, you can check out my part 1 video where I covered over 25-ish fashion industry terms and acronyms that you may come across when you start your career in the industry. And because the list is just could go on forever, I thought we should do a part 2 and go through 30 plus more terms and acronyms to help you get ready for hopefully your burgeoning career in the fashion industry, or if you're just curious to learn some new terms. So let's jump right in. Okay, so before we get started, just a warning that if you hear any white noise in the background, it is my air conditioner. I'm recording on a day when it's about 1,000,000 degrees in Texas, so I'm trying not to die of heat stroke while I record this video for you. I'll drop in some background music, hopefully you won't even be able to notice, but if you hear a little white noise in the background, that's what it is. Okay, so our first term is drape. So drape can be used a couple different ways. Drape can be a fabric attribute, which really just refers to the slinkiness or the floppiness of a fabric. So something with a lot of drape would be a silkier, softer, or a knit fabric that wants to conform around whatever you drop it over. That would be a fabric with high drape. And something without a lot of drape would be like a heavy cotton twill, or a denim, that if you laid it over something, it'll kind of like tent out at an angle, but it's not really going to conform to whatever you've draped it over. So that's a good way to think about drape as a fabric attribute. Drape can also be a verb, and it can refer to making a pattern without starting from a flat paper pattern. So draping is the act of taking, usually starting from full width fabric, draping it over a mannequin or a dress form, and starting to visually kind of pin out, cut out, draw out even. I like to use a fabric marker or a Sharpie, draw out where your armholes are gonna be, where your seams are gonna be. It's really good for pinching out darts and figuring out exactly how to place them, how deep they should be, and all of that. So after you drape something, you can take it and then take it off of the form, lay it flat, and then actually drape a flat paper pattern from that. Or you could digitize it if you have the equipment. Okay, so the next two I'm going to talk about together because they're pretty related. Seam allowance and burst seams. So seam allowance is basically the extra margin of fabric you have after you've sewn the seam. So if you take two pieces of fabric together, you stitch your seam, that extra little bit that kind of pokes into the inside of the garment is your seam allowance. So seam allowance is important because that helps keep the seam itself structured. So it needs a little extra there. You don't want to cut the seam allowance too close to the actual stitch line because the edge of the fabric can fray and that seam can come apart. So seam allowance is really important. So usually industry standard is 1/2 inch on wovens for major connector seams, maybe a little less for like collar attachments and things like that. And on knits, it's pretty much, depending on how stretchy the knit is, you either don't have seam allowance or you assume that you're only going to have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And when I say don't have seam allowance, it means you don't build it into the pattern because it's so stretchy usually that will more than make up for that extra little 1/4 inch you need. So the actual functional seam allowance on a knit would be about a 1/4 inch. Burst seams are really something that mostly pertain to making a woven garment. So again, you sew together your two pieces of fabric, you have your little seam allowance, that extra little margin of fabric that's sticking out past your seam on the inside of the garment. So you sew them together. If you don't want that little edge just sticking straight out on the inside of your garment, you can burst the seam. So you actually will iron flat those two little edges of seam allowance. So if you were doing a side seam on a dress and it was one big piece, I would highly recommend bursting that seam allowance on the side seam. It'll just give you less of those sort of like angular edges when it hits a curve, like from the waist to the hip. It'll just lay flatter. So that's what burst seams are. You take that seam allowance and you burst it flat. So grade is a pattern making term. So when you make a pattern, you usually start with a base size, let's just say it's a medium, and to take that medium and basically make it into a large, make it the next size up, you're going to need to grade that pattern. So that means that you're going to increase the major measurements of that medium. So maybe the chest gets 2 inches bigger for the large. Maybe the length probably doesn't grade that much because a bigger size doesn't necessarily mean the person's taller. So maybe that length grade is a 1/4 inch from a medium to a large, or a 1/2 inch from a medium to a large. So grading is just bumping up those measurements from your base size to the next size, to the next size, to the next size. Okay, tolerance is a term that we use when we're talking about how much we will allow a factory to vary from the specifications we've given them. So if I tell them I want them to make me a size medium garment, and I want that chest measured flat to be exactly 18 inches across, I will allow a little bit above that and a little bit below that in the finished garment, because, you know, things like humidity in the air, preciseness of cutting the fabric out at the cutting phase, and then just sewing, like maybe you stitch up a little too much on that seam allowance, you serge off a little bit more from that one seam than you really intended to. There is that natural variation when you do manufacturing of any kind. So tolerances are just basically how much are we going to allow them to be over that measurement and under that measurement. Okay, next up we're going to talk about directional fabrics. So directional fabrics are important to note so that you don't have something like shading or a printed garment where you have, you know, all of your tree print are all right side up printed across the fabric, and you have the factory cut one side of your shirt with the trees facing up and the other side with the trees facing down, and they sew it together, and you're like, which way is up? One side of the shirt looks right side up, the other side the print looks upside down. So that is a one directional fabric, meaning you can only cut the fabric in one direction for it to, when it's sewn together on the body, for everything to be facing the right side up, right? All those trees you want right side up. Now, a way to get around a one directional fabric and allow the factory to nestle those pieces a little bit closer together, and sometimes that's easier to do if you can sort of toggle them right side up and upside down when you're laying them out to cut. What you can do when you're designing that print is you can alternate a right side up tree with an upside down tree in the print. So the print itself is identical if you look at it this way, or you turn the whole thing around and you look at it this way, because each of those trees is toggled up and down across. So that's a two-directional fabric, right? They can cut the front of your shirt this way and the front of your shirt this way, and as long as you've told them whether or not you want that print to line up in any way, you're going to be okay. You're going to have some trees right side up, some trees upside down on every panel of that garment. Okay, selvage. Selvage are the finished edges of a fabric. So if you ever buy fabric from the fabric store, you will see along the edge there's a section that's usually about a 1/2 inch wide, and it looks like it's had pins poke through it. It's got like little pinholes in it, and sometimes it's a different texture. Sometimes it looks a little melted, or it looks like it has a little bit of glue on it. That is just the finished edge of the fabric, so that when it comes off of the machine, the weaving machine, when it's been completed, it has a finished edge, so it's not just raw, and it's not just gonna unravel. Okay, cuttable width is very much related to selvage, because I may have a fabric that is 60 inches wide from the very, very edge to the very, very edge. Now that's the total width of the fabric, but that's not my usable width. I don't want to cut a pattern piece so close to that edge that I'm going to have those little pinholes or that little melted area, or sometimes it's a little bit warped on the edges. I don't want that to show up in the seam of one of my garments. Aesthetically, it's probably just not going to look good, right? So we talk about full width, maybe 60 inches. Your cuttable width, if you have a 1/2 inch selvage on each side, your cuttable width is going to be 59 inches, right? So minus a half, minus a half. Okay, next up, we're going to talk about nap of a fabric. So nap is really easiest to think about with a corduroy. So if you've ever owned a pair of corduroy pants or a jacket or anything like that, you will know that if you brush your hand down the corduroy one direction, it'll feel very smooth. And if you brush your hand the other way, you'll get more resistance. Like you're raising up all of those little that pile of that corduroy. It's almost like scales, right? So all the scales kind of want to point in one direction. And if you rub your hand down, it's smoother. If you rub your hand up, you're kind of lifting up a lot of those little scales, right? So corduroy definitely has a nap, and you want to make sure you cut it in the right direction. You may want that nap, those scales facing down. That'll give you a little bit more muted of a color in a corduroy. If you want a richer color, you can cut it with those scales kind of facing upright, right, on the garment, and then you're almost like looking down into the shadowed area of that nap. So the color will look darker and richer. What you don't want to do, this is related to directional fabrics again, what you don't want to do is cut one side of your corduroy pants with scales, the nap, down, and the other side with the nap up, because then it's going to look like they're two different colors, even though they're not. The light's just bouncing off of those, that texture in a different way. So nap is really important. Any fabric that has like a fuzziness to it, that fuzziness probably wants to lay in a certain direction, and that's your nap. Okay, this one sounds really close, but it's actually completely different. Nep. So N-E-P. I had never heard this until I was in the fashion industry. I'd never heard it in school even. So nep is basically, best way to describe it is if you've ever seen a tweed fabric. You may see little nubs, little round kind of nubs, they almost look like pills, of different colors. And maybe it's a white, or it's a pink, or it's a whole variety of colors. But it's a little speckle, a little nubby bit that's sticking out that's a different color than the rest of the fabric. So those are actually called neps. And that is something that's desirable if you want that aesthetic for the fabric. So that's why tweed is a great example, because you want that sort of textural, nubby, multicolor sort of effect to it. Okay, next up is submit. So we use submit to describe anything that a mill or a factory is submitting to you for approval. So if you are approving our next term, lab dip, if you get a round of lab dips in, that's a submit. If you reject it, then you need a second submit. And it's important to know that term because that is a term that the mill will use as well. If you ask them to resubmit something, if you say the first two submits were bad, the third submit is better, really good to know that submit is just kind of a round of something they're sending you for approval. So now lab dip. Lab dip is basically what you look at for color. It is made in a lab at the mill. So they take a little piece of your fabric and you say, I want you to dip this color pink. And you probably give them a standard to match. So they will actually, in a lab, color chemist will figure out the formula to dye that thing as closely as possible to that color pink that you want them to hit. So then they will send that first lab dip submit to you, the designer, and you will review it against that standard, decide whether or not you're going to approve it, and then they have a standard to hit when they go to full bulk production and they make all of your bulk yardage. Maybe it's 100 yards, maybe it's 10,000 yards, but that's basically that first little proof that they can hit the color that you want. So that's a lab dip. Cast is another term we use a lot when we're looking at color and looking at different submits from mills. So cast refers to sort of the overall color tint of a color. So a common issue with khakis in general is that sometimes they cast too red. So it still looks like a khaki, it still looks like a medium tan basically, but it's just a little too red or a little too pink. So I would say, you know, maybe I like how light it is, maybe I like other aspects of the color, but maybe I'm just going to tell the factory it's rejected, they need to resubmit, it's casting too red. So that is something you can look at visually, or if you have a color reading machine in your place of business, you can actually read it digitally and send them much more refined numbers. Okay, bulk. I think I already said this word earlier, but bulk is basically the mass production amount. So that's separated from maybe sample yardage to bulk yardage, right? Bulk means the mass amount that you are going to make in production. Okay, handloom. So handloom is a way to look at color on something that is not lab dippable. So a lab dip is made on a piece dye fabric, meaning they weave that fabric all in sort of a natural or undyed color, and then they dip that whole piece of fabric to your specified color. So that's a piece dye. You can do a lab dip on that, but for yarn dye, you would need to do a hand loom. So yarn dye is what it sounds like. Instead of weaving the whole fabric in an undyed state, you're actually going to weave it with already dyed yarns. So maybe you have a gray going one direction and a black going the other direction. Sorry, my dog's jingling around. But basically the yarns are already dyed, and then they weave them into whatever pattern you want. But the approval, the little mini proof that they do for you before they weave all of the bulk yardage is called a hand loom. So that is what it sounds like. They weave by hand on a little tiny loom those yarns, because those would be the same color yarns they would use on the machines to weave your full production yardage. They're just taking those yarns, weaving a tiny little piece for you, and sending you a hand loom submit to review and see if it's about where you want to be. So next up are dope dye, aka fiber dye. So this pertains only to synthetic fibers, so your polyesters, your nylons, things like that. And this happens actually further upstream than the other two dyeing options. So for a fiber dye, you will actually start with basically the slurry before it becomes a fiber in a yarn. You can actually add dye stuffs directly to that liquid before you extrude it out and turn it into a polyester fiber. So this actually can save a lot of water. It can give you longer lasting color, especially in black. And it's just a little bit less intensive to color, because you're not dyeing something at a later state. So there's typically less byproducts from doing a fiber dye or a dope dye. Okay, a couple more terms. Next up is proto, short for prototype. So this is typically your first sample that you'll request from the factory. So you'll take your sketch, you work with your tech designer, they get, a tech pack made with all of the sketches and measurements and information. Maybe you fill out your BOM with all of the body fabric and zippers and threads and buttons that you want them to use. You send that over to your factory and they make you a first sample, your proto, and send it back to you. So you can look at it for fit. You can look at it for, are all the pockets placed where I want? Are the design details placed where I want? Overall, did my concept kind of come to fruition in this first proto? You can also evaluate it for whether or not the factory actually followed your instructions. So maybe you're halfway there, but they didn't quite put the yoke in the right place, or they didn't quite finish off a seam the way you thought. So you can evaluate your first prototype, make the corrections, and either get in a second prototype or go straight to further sampling. Okay, filament versus spun. So when we were talking about fiber dye earlier, we talked about how polyester and other synthetic fibers start as kind of this liquid slurry. That is extruded through a little spinneret, and it can become one of two things: either filament, which is one long continuous fiber, think of like fishing line, so one long, super long continuous fiber, or it can be spun, which means that fiber is kind of chopped up into these little pieces. So to give you an idea of what that means, when those fibers are spun into yarns and then made into fabrics, a filament yarn is going to be very compact, smooth little yarns, whereas a spun polyester is going to have a little bit duller of a finish. It's not going to be as shiny, and there's different applications for both. One's not necessarily better than the other, but those are kind of the two options you have. Extrude it out into one long piece or chop it up. I'm losing my voice. Okay, for this half of the video, we're going to talk about acronyms. So all of those little 3 and 4 letter abbreviations that you're going to hear in your career in the fashion industry, and you may not know exactly what they mean. There's a ton of them. A lot of them are very company specific as well, so some of them you just kind of have to pick up when you get your sea legs at the company, but there are others that are pretty industry standard. So I'm going to take you through some that are actually kind of product and design related, and some that are just corporate related in general. Okay, first up, EPI and PPI. So these stand for ends per inch and picks per inch. So essentially, when you have a fabric, you can look at how many yarns. That's what an end or a pick or an end is. So you look at how many yarns there are per inch in each direction. So ends and picks. Okay, SPI is the next one. That stands for stitches per inch. So this is something you probably want to list out in your tech pack to make sure the factory is following it, because you don't want them to default to the fewest stitches per inch, because that means each stitch will be a little bit fatter, a little bit longer. And if you have like 6 stitches per inch, you have more of a chance of that seam breaking, and you just have like, it's not going to be as clean of a seam because you're only like biting through it every so often, right? So something that's more of a 10 or a 12 stitch per inch, it's going to be a more secure seam because those threads are punching through and locking more times in an inch. And it's usually going to give you just a smoother seam as well with less puckering. So that's what stitches per inch, or SPI, means. Next up, these are related to the Pantone color system. So TCX, that actually, I had to look it up. It's at the end of every Pantone, textile color, but I never actually knew what it stood for. So TCX actually stands for Textiles Cotton Extended Range, but collectively they're referred to as the FHI, or Fashion, Home, and Interiors Color Book. That sounds like a lot of words, but it basically means I want to see those colors on cotton. There's also other fabrics you can get those color chips on, which is great, especially if you work in activewear and you want to look at things on polyester. But we look at everything on cotton, just where I work. So all of the Pantone numbers are like 2 digits dash 4 digits, and then TCX at the end. That's important because there's also a Fashion and Home paper guide that ends in TPX, and like any other color, if you look at it on a cotton swatch versus a piece of paper, it's going to look a little bit different. The paper is usually a little bit duller and just not as rich of a color. So if I tell a factory to dip Pantone whatever TPX, but the cotton swatch in front of me is a TCX, I'm going to be probably not happy when I get that lab dip in and I see that it's really dull. I'm going to think, why aren't they hitting my TCX color standard? Well, maybe it's because I didn't specify and they just bought the paper chip because they probably don't have a whole Pantone Fashion, Home, and Interiors guide at their factory or their mill, because those books are thousands and thousands of dollars. So you always need to specify. If you were looking at the cotton color standard and you want them to match that, you've got to specify TCX. Okay, the other Pantone color system we'll sometimes use. It is more common in the graphic design and the materials that aren't fabric design world. PMS, which stands for the Pantone Matching System. So these are usually 3 or 4 digits that either end with a C for coated, means it's a little glossy, or U for uncoated, which means it's a little bit flatter of a finish. Now, sometimes as a fashion designer, you will use PMS codes if you're doing things like a rubberized print, or possibly a woven label, or a screen print. You're probably gonna want to reference those PMS Pantone colors as opposed to your Fashion, Home, and Interior colors. PMS is just a little bit more standard when you're doing anything related to graphic design. Okay, SMS. SMS stands for Salesman Sample. So after your proto, maybe you approve it, you're happy with how it looks, you're going to go and order your salesman samples, which is actually what your salespeople use to sell off of. So you always want your salesman samples to be as perfect as possible. The final fabric, the final color, the final trims, all of that, because that is what you are selling to the customer. So you want that to be as correct as possible. That's what a SMS, or a salesman sample, is. Another type of sample is PP. That stands for pre-production. So that should be the sample that you get before all of your bulk production, thousands and thousands of garments are made. You should get a PP in first. Usually your product development manager or your tech design person will look at it, make sure it matches everything that the designer has specified, and then they will tell the factory to go ahead into bulk production. Your TOP is your top of production. So that actually does come from the production line when bulk is up and running. Okay, now we're getting into the more corporate terms that apply kind of across a bunch of other industries as well. So ESG is the first one. It stands for Environmental Sustainability and Governance. So sustainability is obviously a huge topic of conversation for all brands, especially the fashion industry. So ESG is kind of the shorthand for anything that falls within earth or environmentally conscious efforts, sustainable efforts, which could also include like ethicality of your overseas vendors and, are you a responsible company, things like that, and governance. So if you hear ESG, just think sustainability and responsibility. Okay, DEI or DEIB, as some companies have moved to, stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if there's a B at the end, that also includes belonging. So this is sort of corporate speak for any of your efforts to make sure that you have diverse hiring practices, that everyone at work feels welcome, that everyone gets what they need. Equity is actually different from equality, right? Equality means everyone gets a 1-foot step ladder to stand on to see over a fence, right? Regardless of your height, everyone gets the same thing because everyone's equal, right? Equity is you get a 1-foot step ladder if that's enough to get you to see over the fence. If the person next to you is a little shorter, maybe they need a 2-foot step ladder to see over the fence. That's equity. Equity is taking into account that not everyone is starting from the same place. And then of course, belonging and inclusion really speak to companies' efforts to make their associates and their employees feel like they can bring either their whole self or as much of their whole self as they want to the office and not be discriminated against, right? So inclusion is they can be themselves. Belonging is they have really deep relationships and a sense of purpose at the place that they work. So DEI is another one. You'll hear quite a bit, really regardless of where you work. Okay, we've got just a few more to get through. KPI is another one you'll hear quite a bit in the corporate world. It stands for Key Performance Indicator. So that's a fancy way to say, how am I measuring your success, either as a person or as a department? So you always want to hit your KPIs, which is your company KPIs, that you're this profitable. Maybe your personal KPI is that you improve margin by X% in a season or a year. KPI is really specific to you and your role or your department's kind of overall goal. So it's good to know what KPI means because you'll probably hear it before you'll hear it explained. Another one that you'll hear everywhere is AOR. So that stands for Areas of Responsibility. Again, what is your responsibility at work? What lives in your realm? What should you take charge of? So AOR is quite a commonly used one as well. Okay, FTC stands for the Federal Trade Commission. So the FTC does, issue decisions and guidelines that kind of govern all areas of trade and business. So FTC is an important one to know because at some point an FTC decision or the new green guides that they're working on will affect your job and your company and your position. So good to know about the FTC. AIQ is one that I've heard quite a bit in my time in the industry. I'm not sure how much it's used in other apparel and fashion companies, but I love it. It stands for Apparel IQ or Apparel Intelligence Quotient. So this is short term for how much do you know about the industry, not just your role, but how maze bright are you? How well versed are you in everything to do with the fashion industry? Not just how to make a garment, how to design a garment, how to source or cost a garment, but overall, how intelligent are you about the apparel industry? Okay, the last two are tricky. If you asked me off the cuff what these stood for, I would probably get it wrong, but since I have it in front of me, I can cheat a little bit. AATCC. So this is an abbreviation you're gonna see behind a lot of different test methods. So does this hold up to home laundering? Does it hold up to perspiration? Does it hold up to sun exposure? All the things that garment companies test their products for. A lot of those methods have been sort of pioneered and solidified by the AATCC. That actually stands for American Association of Textile Chemists and Colorists, but almost no one will ever use that full long drawn out name. Everyone says AATCC. And all you need to know is that is a very scientifically defined test method for a certain thing you're testing a fabric or a garment for. There's also another organization, the American Society for Testing and Materials, or the ASTM. Again, you'll never hear the long version, you're only going to hear ASTM. That is just a different organization that has come up with test methods. So you may see a test method called out on your specifications you want a mill or a factory to hit, and you may have some AATCC test methods called out, and everything's numbered, so it's very clear exactly what you're asking them to do. And others will have an ASTM test method. So it's basically, as a company, as a brand, whatever you decide you want your test standards to be. And you can mix and match kind of AATCC or ASTM based on what you need to prove that your garment or your fabric can do. Okay, so that's it. Thank you for sticking with me on this very, very hot day. I hope you learned something today and you walked away from this just a little bit better prepared for your career in the fashion industry. Or maybe you just learned something fun that's a little bit of trivia that maybe you can use with your friends. So anyway, thank you guys so much for joining. I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Bye.